we have been looking a little bit at the history of the Heter Mechirah, the arguments for and against. Now, I want to actually focus on exactly how the Heter Mechirah was developed by those poskim that allowed it. So the first condition that has to be proven is that the Shmitta b'zman hazeh is a rabbinic law. So there are several places in the Gemara where this is discussed. The primary place that most people refer to prove it's the Rabbanan is the Gemara in Mועד Cotton, Daf Beis on the base. The Mishnah says, Mashkin beis השלחין במועד ובשביעית, that we're allowed to water fields that require watering as opposed to fields that are self-watering. They get enough rain and the aquifer is high enough and so on that they don't need to be watered. We're allowed to water them on chol moed and on shmita. Amar Abiy. So the Gemara is trying to figure out why this should be true. בשביעית בזמן הזה, Abiy says we're talking about shmita in our time. ורבי, and this is the opinion of Rebbe, Detnיא, as we learned in the Brisa. Rebbe says, v'zeh dvar hashmita, and this is the matter of the shmita, shmot, that it annuls. Bestei shmitos eksu medber. The Torah is talking about two types of shmitos. Achas shmitas karka, ve'achas shmitas k'safim. One is that the land rests, and the other is that we forgive debts at the end of the year, between the last second of the year before the beginning of the next year. Bzman she'ata meshamet karka, ta meshamet k'safim. When the land rests, then you release debts. Bzman she'ata meshamet karka, i'ata meshamet k'safim. And when there is a time when you are not required to let the land rest, then you don't have to release people from their debts. So, according to this, there has to be a time when the debts are not released, when the ground does not have to rest, and so that would be when we'll see in another Gemara exactly when it is. But whatever that time period is, that's rabbinic in nature, Shmita at that point. Rabbi disagrees. Afilu tema Rabbanan. No, even if you want to say it's the Rabbanan that holds Shmita at all times is from Torah law. Abos asa rechmana, todos lo asa rechmana. When we're talking about something that's going to create a great loss, like not watering this field where everything will die in it if we don't water it, that's watering is really a rabbinic prohibition derived from zriya, from planting. And the primary prohibitions were prohibited by the Torah, but the secondary prohibitions, the rabbinic prohibitions, obviously, since they're rabbinic in nature, were not prohibited by the Torah, and them we would be allowed to do in Shmita. So the question is, when does Shmita cease to be from Torah? At what point in time was Shmita only the Rabbanan? We talk about it starting after the land was conquered and divided up in the tribes, so 14 years after Yahushua began conquering the land. But at what point does it end? So the Gemara in Archim, Daf Beis on base, says, Detnיא, we learned in the Brisa, Mishgalo shevet Ruvain v'shevet Gad v'chatzi shevet Menashe, batlu yovlos. When the tribe of Ruvain, Gad, and half of the tribe of Menashe were exiled in First Temple times, then Yovel ceased to exist. If Yovel doesn't exist, then Shmita and Shmita's K'safim doesn't exist. Yovel is a greater form, so to speak, of both Yovel and Yovel is a greater form of Shmita and Shmita's K'safim, in that land returns that otherwise wouldn't return, and so on. As it says, Ukrasim Dor ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha. You will call freedom, you will proclaim freedom to the land, throughout the land and to the inhabitants thereof. B'zman shekol yoshveha laha, v'lo b'zman shegalu mikzasan. This is when all of its inhabitants, or let us say representatives of all the tribes, are upon it, but not when some of them have been exiled. Yachol hayu aleha vehen uravin. Maybe they can be there but mixed up, meaning like today where we don't know who's from what tribe. Shevet Binyamin b'Yehuda v'Shevet Yehuda b'Binyamin. Where you see Binyamin has little sparks of land, pieces of land here and there among Binyamin, and Yehuda gets mixed up in Binyamin sometimes. Yeh Yovel Noheg. Will the Jubilee apply at such a time? Talmud Lomer, that the Gemara says, L'kol yoshveha, to all its inhabitants. Bzman sheyoshvim ketikunan, when they're living properly, each tribe in its area. Below bzman shehem mu'ravim, and not when they're mixed up with each other. So Yovel requires the biblical divisions of the land to the biblical tribes that were in them, and people living where they're supposed to be, not randomly throughout the land. So clearly, according to this, once the beginning of the exile of the Shvatim begins to take place, several hundred years before the destruction of the first Beis Mikdash, the Shmita ceases to be from Torah origin. Now, there's another Gemara in Sanhedrin, and Daf Chafav Amalef, Amar Rabbi Shimon. B'techila hayu korin osan osvei shvis. In the beginning, they called them people that gather up produce of the Shemitah year. Now, there's a Mishnah earlier that talks about different people that have rabbinic psuleators. They cannot testify in court for rabbinic reasons, and one of them are people that are gathering up or selling produce of the Shemitah year. My Kamer, what does it mean that they're gathering produce of the Shemitah year? Amar Yehuda Hachi Kamer. Rabbi Yehuda says this is what it means. B'tchila hayu omrim osvei shvis ksherim. Sochrei psulim. In the beginning, they would say those people that gather up produce of the Shemitah year are puzzled to testify, are kosher to testify, the people that only gather it, but those people that sell it are puzzled, meaning you can gather it up. It's told it belongs to anyone. It's Hefker, so anyone can go out in the fields and gather things up. There's rabbinic legislation, or perhaps Torah legislation, depending as we learned earlier. You can't act like you're the owner of it. You can't harvest the whole thing at one time, and so on. But a person can go out, and certainly in a rabbinic way, you're not supposed to harvest more than the food for 3 meals at a time, and so on. Mishirabu mamtsi'e maos lanim, when the number of people that would press the poor for funds, fazalanim v'asfulahu, then the poor would go out and gather them produce, meaning the poor would be put under pressure or enticed to gather up for the merchants produce of the Shemitah year. The merchants, of course, wouldn't go themselves out to the fields, but they would get poor people to go out and gather them produce so they could sell it. Umaisu, and they would bring it in. The poor would bring it in. Chazri lomar echad ze ve'echad ze pasulim, because originally the poor were doing it just for their own sustenance. So of course they can do it, and it's not a problem, even if they're selling a little bit of it. As we previously learned, that's not a problem to sell a little bit, as long as you're not doing it in the commercial way. Now they're gathering in a commercial way, so this would become a problem. Kasha who b'nei Rachava, the b'nei Rachava had a problem. Hi mishrabu ha'anasim. What does it mean when there are more people causing problems? Forcers, literally. Mishrabu hatagrim mibayle. It should say when there were more merchants. If you're talking about merchants coming around to make people gather up fruit so they can sell it, that we should say there are more merchants. What are you talking about? The financial pressures. Originally we said both of them are puzzle. Mishrabu hanasim. But when there was more pressure put on, umayninhu, and what is this pressure? Arnona, the tax. The Roman government had a tax. And originally, we know from Roman documents, they didn't collect the land tax on Shemitah year, because they knew people didn't grow. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, or maybe after the revolt that resulted in the destruction of the Beis Mikdash, the Romans insisted upon collecting the tax also on the Shemitah year. So if they didn't get the crops as the tax during the Shemitah year, then at that point they would take the land in its place. So therefore Rebbe Yanai would announce, Puku v'zaru b'shvis, go out and plant your field during the Shemitah year. Mishum arnona, so that you can pay the arnona. Chazru lomar osfim ksherim sochrim psulim. At that point, they say those people that gather up the produce of the Shemitah year, because Rebbe Yanai has allowed it, because then, therefore, these people are kosher. However, the people that are doing normal business with it in the normal way, that's possible. Meaning, if you grow it, you give it to the Romans to pay the tax, we don't have a problem with that. That's what you're supposed to do, so the Romans don't take over the land of Eretz Yisrael. All right, so Rashi says here, Paku Zaru B'Shvis. How is it that Rebbe Yanai says you can go out and plant during the Shemitah year? Shvish b'zman Medrabbanan, that we're talking about Shemitah in our time, to batla kedushas haaretz, because when there is Torah sanctity of the land, Shemitah is deresa. So now that when some of the tribes have been exiled and it's not kol yoshvei ha'alaha, therefore Rashi is saying there is no obligation in Shemitah from the Torah. Now, this is the opinion of the vast majority of Rishonim. However, the Ramban and Sefer Zechus on Gittin, Daf Lamed Vav, and Tosfos, Rosh, and Moed Katan that we previously looked at, they paskin like the Chamim that Shmita b'zman hazeh is deresa. However, they are the only two that Rishonim that paskin that way. Rashi here paskins, as we just saw, that Shemitah is derabbanan. Tosfos and Archin, the Gemara that we previously looked at, paskins that it's derabbanan. The Rashba in several places, and the Ritva, the Ran, the Yad Ramah, the Tur, all paskin that Shemitah b'zman hazeh is a din derabbanan. Now, the Rambam becomes a major point of discussion. The Rambam says in Shemitah v'Yovel, Perek Yud Halacha Tes, Ubizman she'ayovel noheg, when the Yovel applies noheg din eved ivri, then the halachas of a Jewish slave apply. V'din batei arichoma, the special halachas that refer to buying and selling houses in walled cities. V'din sedei charamim, and the fields that are dedicated to the temple, and if they're not redeemed, would go to the Kohanim. V'din stei achuzah, and the inherited, all the halachas of an inherited field, and who inherits it and how. Umikablim ger toshav, and we can accept the ger toshav. This is someone that accepts the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach in front of the Beis Din. V'noheges shvis ba'aretz v'shmitas k'safim b'kol makom min Torah, and the shmita applies in Eretz Yisrael, and shmitas k'safim, releasing people from their debts, applies to every place in the world, min Torah. Ubizman she'ein hayovel noheg, but at a time when the shmita does not apply, einu noheg echad mikol elu chutz mishvis ba'aretz shmatas k'safim b'kol makom midivreihem k'moshe b'yarnu. None of these halachas apply except the din of Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael and releasing people from their debts every place in the world, like we have explained. So we'll look and see where the Rambam says it in other places in a second. So you see, the Rambam also is holding that Shemitah b'zman hazeh is a din derabbanan, not a din deresa. In the halachas of Mechirah, Perek Hey halacha tesvav, Avol chiyuv haaretz b'shvis uvemasros einu elu mipnei shu kivush rabim. The obligation to keep trumos and maasros, and maybe Shemitah as well, is only because it was conquered by all of Klal Yisrael. B'shvis uvemasros al haderech shebiyarnu b'ilchos truma, and so too is the halacha of Shemitah and Maasros, like we've explained in the laws of Truma. So all of these things are dependent on Kivush Rabim. Kivush Rabim is that all of Klal Yisrael conquers Eretz Yisrael. If significant parts are missing, then it wouldn't be called Kivush Rabim, it would be called Kivush Yachid. And this has certain halachic implications, because most of the Jews didn't return to Eretz Yisrael during the Second Temple, certainly not to build it and retake the land make it our land again as opposed to other people's land. Therefore, it was viewed as kivush yachid, and therefore shmita was only derabbanan, not deraisa. And so the Rambam, as he said, he's explained this in Hilchos Truma. What does the Rambam say in Hilchos Truma? Truma b'zman hazeh eino min Torah ela midivrehim. Truma in our times is not from the Torah; it's a rabbinic law. Shein lecha truma ela be'eretz Yisrael bilvad ubezman shekol Yisrael sham. The only time you have truma is from the Torah is from Eretz Yisrael. I mean, there is truma in Egypt and Syria and Jordan and so on, but these are all rabbinic in nature. We only have it in Eretz Yisrael, and at the time when all of Israel is there. Shenamar ki savo bi, when you will come, bias kulchem, all of you have to come. Now, there is a lot that has been learned out of these Rambams, and we will begin to look at that in the next lesson so we can have a better understanding of this whole idea of Shmita being d'oraisa or d'rabbanan. Everyone should have a wonderful day.